Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the 1970s. We're going to be covering the period 1968 to 1980. Those are the chapters in some of the famous APUSH books, so let's get started. Keep in mind we're talking about the presidencies of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter when we're talking about this time period. So this time period really begins with the election of 1968, the return of Richard Nixon. Remember, 1968 is a political mess. The Tet Offensive had happened. LBJ announces he's not going to run for re-election. Martin Luther King is killed, Robert F. Kennedy is killed, and riots are spreading throughout the country in urban areas. These events are not necessarily all connected, but there's a lot of political turmoil in the country. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago, riots break out outside as police and protesters clash with one another, and the Vice President Humphrey gets the nomination. There's a third party running in 1968. George Wallace runs as the American Independent Party candidate, and he is ultra-conservative. He opposes federal desegregation, he's against the anti-war protests, and he's also against the Great Society. The other conservative candidate isn't as extreme as George Wallace. He is Richard Nixon, and we saw him before. He's back, and in 1968, Nixon wins the presidency as many Americans turned away from the New Deal liberalism of the Great Society programs, of big government, in favor of Nixon and other conservative candidates. When Nixon takes office, there are 500,000 troops in Vietnam, roughly, and he is going to have to deal with this situation. Him and his right-hand man, his foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, are going to promise to end the war in Vietnam with something they call peace with honor. In fact, Nixon appeals to what he claims is the silent majority, those Americans who are not in the streets protesting, who really support the war and what the United States is trying to do in Vietnam. Keep in mind, since the Tet Offensive in 1968 in January, the debate over the Vietnam War had only intensified, and there was fierce protest throughout, especially on college campuses, about the Vietnam War. This continues to escalate as news of events like the My Lai massacre, which occurred actually in 1968, but the news of it surfaces in 1970, where American soldiers go into this village and gun down many innocent women and children. Nixon does try to disengage the United States with something called the Nixon Doctrine. And basically what it said was U.S. would continue to honor its commitments, but countries in Asia would not be able to always rely on U.S. ground troops. In other words, they're going to need to do some of the fighting on their own. So let's take a look at what Nixon does in Vietnam. And really it's kind of this ending the war while also escalating the war, these two kind of opposing things. Nixon has a policy called Vietnamization, which called for the U.S. to gradually withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam. Remember, this is the whole idea behind the Nixon Doctrine. What it means is the South Vietnamese, the army of South Vietnam, would slowly take over the fighting and challenge of defending South Vietnam against the communists. The U.S. would continue to give money, weapons, and training, but U.S. ground troops would slowly leave, as you could see on that graphic right there. Nixon also, while pursuing a policy called Vietnamization, is widening the war at the same time. He begins secret bombing of neutral Cambodia. You could see it right here on the map, and the reason why he's bombing secretly Cambodia, and in April of 1970 sending U.S. troops into Cambodia, is because they're trying to destroy Vietnamese communist bases in the country. Remember, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a secret network, and it was going through Cambodia, and Nixon broadens the war. In response to the bombing of Cambodia, protests erupt. Eventually, news of the bombing is revealed, and those protests erupt on college campuses, most famously at Kent State University in Ohio, where the National Guard guns down 4 students in a tragedy, and also at Jackson State in Mississippi, where 2 African American students are killed. The third part of Nixon's approach to the Vietnam War is holding secret negotiations with North Vietnam. You have Henry Kissinger holding off-the-record talks trying to negotiate an end to the war. And in 1972, when negotiations start to slow down, Nixon orders a massive bombing on North Vietnam to try to pressure them into submitting to U.S. demands. Now, as a result of all these different events, distrust in the government grows. It's not just during Nixon, but really you have all these events, the Tet Offensive, where we thought the war was almost over and we have this massive attack, news of the My Lai massacre, the bombing of Cambodia leads to further distrust of the government. In fact, one of the things that happens is you have the Pentagon Papers revealed that the U.S. government, from John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson onward, were deliberately deceiving the American people about the Vietnam War. Those Pentagon Papers were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. He gets that information and leaks it to the press. Nixon tries to prevent their publication, but it eventually is published. And Congress passes the War Powers Act in an effort to reduce the war powers of the president. Remember, ever since the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, the United States president, from Lyndon Johnson onward, had a blank check to fight and escalate the war in Vietnam. The War Powers Act seeks to reduce this power. For example, the president must tell Congress within 48 hours of sending troops into conflict, and Congress would have to approve any military mission that lasted longer than 60 days. And presidential power is checked slightly. So how does this war in Vietnam end? Well, you have that three-part approach: the Vietnamization, South Vietnam taking over the fighting; the widening of the war, bombing North Vietnam and engaging in Cambodia; and the secret negotiations between Kissinger and his counterpart in North Vietnam. And eventually, they have the Paris Accords, which is a ceasefire signed in January of 1973. Both sides agree, stop the fighting. The problem is U.S. troops are withdrawn from Vietnam slowly and eventually permanently. Free elections were supposed to take place between the two Vietnams, but unfortunately the ceasefire did not permanently end the fighting between the North and the South. In fact, many North Vietnamese troops were still in South Vietnam. By this point, millions of Vietnamese people are dead, 58,000 American soldiers are dead, billions of dollars are spent, and by April of 1975, the U.S.-supported government of South Vietnam fell to communist rule, and Vietnam became a united communist country. This is a huge blow to U.S. prestige, and it happens during the Ford administration. Nixon's gone by this point, but basically the war in Vietnam is considered by many to be a failure. Another important thing to know about Nixon's presidency is the policy of détente, a relaxing of tensions during the Cold War. In fact, Nixon and Kissinger sought to take advantage of the distrust and rivalry between China and the Soviet Union. This is the Sino-Soviet split. Although Khrushchev and Mao could be seen playing cards or something right there, there was an ideological disagreement and rivalry between the Soviets and China. Nixon, with a reputation as a hardcore anti-communist figure, remember back in the 50s during his Alger Hiss investigation, he could negotiate without being accused of being soft on communism. Remember, many Democrats got accused of that. Nixon had the reputation of always fighting the communists. Nixon shocks the world when he visits China in February of 1972. He meets with Mao, and secret negotiations were going on before Nixon goes, and this is a huge shift in U.S. policy towards China, and is part of his policy of détente. Formal diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China won't take place until 1979 under Carter, but Nixon really kind of changes this relationship. As a result, the relationship with China puts pressure on the Soviets to kind of be willing to negotiate with the U.S. You could see Nixon kind of balancing between his visit to China and the Soviet Union. Another part of détente that you should know about is a treaty was signed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union limiting anti-ballistic missiles, ABMs, and, very important you know, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I, which limited nuclear weapons between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Both his policies in China and the Soviet Union, once again, are all about détente, the relaxation of tensions. Nixon was able to reduce the arms race and the Cold War tensions, but it does not completely end the arms race or the Cold War. While Nixon had some success in the foreign policy realm, he's really going to have his downfall in what he does domestically. Nixon's administration had a group called the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, and in 1972, Nixon wanted to guarantee his re-election against the Democratic challenger, George McGovern. In fact, in June of 1972, a group of men, you can see them right there in the photo, working for Nixon's re-election were caught breaking into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Nixon and his administration claimed that they had no knowledge of this break-in, and it's important to note, though, even before this, Nixon's people had been doing some things. He ordered wiretaps on government employees and reporters to stop the leaks that were happening. Remember, Daniel Ellsberg published the Pentagon Papers, and that was a huge embarrassment for the U.S. government. In fact, there was a group of people called plumbers who were created to stop the leaks and discredit those people who were opponents to the administration. For example, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office was broken into trying to find information to discredit him. All of this is being done secretly, and the other thing that was happening was government agencies such as the IRS were used to investigate opponents of Nixon and or the Vietnam War. Up until this point, there's no absolute proof that Nixon ordered these illegal activities, but they were taking place, and now the Watergate break-in becomes public. Needless to say, there's an investigation, the Watergate investigation, and this is eventually going to lead to impeachment. The investigation quickly reveals that Nixon did participate in the cover-up of these illegal activities. Although he claims he didn't order them, he definitely had a hand in trying to cover them up. It was discovered that Nixon had secretly recorded conversations in the Oval Office using a tape recording system, and investigators wanted access to the tapes to prove that Nixon was involved in a cover-up. Nixon claims executive privilege. He does not want to hand over the tapes, but eventually the Supreme Court ruled that he must turn over the tapes, and he does so in 1974. Meanwhile, during all this investigation, his vice president resigns in the fall of 1973. When it's discovered that he took bribes, Gerald Ford is appointed as vice president. And when Nixon finally turns in the tapes, there's nearly a 20-minute gap in one of the tapes right after the Watergate break-in. In addition to all of this information, prior to this, in October of 1973, Nixon fired the special prosecutor in charge of investigating the case against Nixon. Clearly, it was looking like Nixon was in fact interfering with the investigation, and the missing part of the tape reveals that Nixon was trying to cover things up. The Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General resign in protest to Nixon's behavior. This is known as the Saturday Night Massacre. All of these government officials are resigning or being fired. And finally, impeachment charges are put forward on President Nixon. One for obstruction of justice, trying to cover things up and to impede the investigation. Two, for an abuse of power, using the IRS to discredit or to harass opponents. And contempt of Congress. Knowing that this trial is going to go to the Senate, impeachment does not mean you're removed from office immediately. Nixon resigns on August 1974, and Gerald Ford becomes the first unelected president in U.S. history. It's important you know the importance of Watergate is that it demonstrated once again the increasing loss of faith in the federal government. Some important things to know about the politics of the 1970s. Nixon and Gerald Ford wanted to limit the size of the federal government. They are Republicans. They are relatively conservative. And in the 1970s, you saw a combination of economic slowdown, stagnation, and high inflation, which is oftentimes referred to as stagflation. So the economy was really sputtering throughout much of the 1970s. Gerald Ford, one of the kind of significant things he does is he pardons Nixon in 1974, really shortly after taking office. The pardon is not popular. It really hurts the Republican Party, and it's going to be bad news for Ford in the election of 1976. In that election, Ford runs, but he is defeated easily by the Democrat, a kind of Washington, D.C. outsider by the name of Jimmy Carter. Former governor of Georgia, he is now president, and a couple things about his foreign policy. Carter's going to seek to pursue a humanitarian foreign policy, kind of smoothing over relations between the U.S. and much of the rest of the world. He's going to have some success in this area. A real blow to U.S.-Soviet relations happens when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. This is seen as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. They're going to get bogged down in this war, and it's going to be a very costly and unpopular war. And as a response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. is going to boycott the Olympic Games that were to be held in Moscow. One area that's really important is the drama in the Middle East that takes place throughout the 1970s. Shocking to think there is drama in the Middle East. During the Yom Kippur War, Syria and Egypt suddenly attacked Israel in 1973. Yom Kippur is a Jewish holiday, and what Egypt and Syria were trying to do is get the land that was lost to them during the Six-Day War in 1967, that area in the blue. This surprise attack leads the U.S. to provide their ally Israel with economic and military aid, billions of dollars worth, and Israel successfully defended itself once again. However, this leads to much of the Arab world, which never liked Israel to begin with. They impose an oil embargo upon the United States, and this is done by the oil-rich Arab nations in OPEC. This causes all sorts of havoc in the domestic economy of the United States, as there were gas shortages. The speed limit was reduced in an effort to save gas, and combining this with the already high inflation of the 1970s and the loss of manufacturing jobs, this causes huge economic problems for the U.S. There is some good news coming out of the Middle East. In 1978, President Carter helps negotiate the Camp David Accords, and Israel and Egypt sign a peace agreement with one another. You can see them shaking hands and signing papers right there. This is a huge shift because Egypt becomes the first Arab nation to formally recognize Israel. However, 1 year later, once again, a big old mess in the Middle East when the U.S.-supported Shah of Iran was overthrown by Islamic fundamentalists in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. If you remember, the Shah of Iran was put in power by the CIA back in 1953. Many Iranians did not like this guy. He was a dictator, and the revolution kicks him out of power. There's a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment in the country. As a result of this anti-U.S. sentiment, another oil shortage takes place, price increases in the United States. During this revolution, the situation gets worse when in 1979 more than 50 people are taken hostage at the American embassy in Tehran. Carter tries a rescue mission that is a complete bust. It's another foreign policy failure, which leads to even more distrust and lack of confidence in the U.S. government, and the hostage crisis will drag on. Finally, what's up with civil rights in the 1970s? A couple things you should know about. In 1979, Congress passes Title IX, which sought to end sex discrimination in schools. An example of the impact of Title IX can be seen in the fact that schools must provide girls and women with equal athletic opportunities. It's a historic achievement for equality in the area of gender. Following year, Roe versus Wade's decision gets handed down by the Supreme Court, and Roe v. Wade struck down laws prohibiting abortion on the grounds that they were a violation of a woman's right to privacy. Roe v. Wade legalizes abortion and remains a hotly debated topic even today. The Equal Rights Amendment, which had been advocated all the way back to Alice Paul days in the 1920s, was passed by Congress but fell short of ratification by 3 states. In fact, Phyllis was one of the leaders of the opposition to the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. She opposed it on the grounds that it would destroy traditional gender roles, traditional values, and she mobilizes enough support to see it defeated. Another thing going on in the late 60s and early 70s with regard to civil rights is the American Indian movement. It's founded in 1968, and it sought to address past injustices and to demand social and economic equality. You have the famous occupation of Alcatraz Island over there in San Francisco Bay. You have the occupation of the battle site of Wounded Knee, which happened back in 1890, and instilling a pride of Native American culture and raising awareness about Native American issues. And you also get another Supreme Court case, the University of California in 1978 versus Bake, which upheld affirmative action. And in this case, the court ruled that race could be one of several factors considered in admissions. You could not have quotas, but you could consider a person's race. And speaking of the court and rights, it's really important you know about the Warren Court. Warren Court is going to be from 1953 to 1969, and really what's important about the Warren Court, and you can see Earl Warren right there with the red arrow there, liberal ideals such as expanding democracy and individual freedoms were realized in the decisions of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren. A couple of examples of these court cases and how they expanded individual rights you could see in Yates versus U.S. The court ruled the First Amendment does protect radical or revolutionary speech as long as it does not create a clear and present danger. So communists are protected under the First Amendment. Mapp versus Ohio, illegally seized evidence can't be used in court, so this is protecting those accused of a crime. Engel versus Vitale in 1962, can't require prayer in public schools. This violated the First Amendment separation between church and state. Griswold versus Connecticut, a citizen has the right to privacy, thus birth control cannot be prohibited. And Miranda versus Arizona, if you ever watch cop shows, the right to remain silent and speak with an attorney. And this establishes your Miranda rights. Keep in mind, there were critics to the Warren Court's decisions. Many conservatives did not like these decisions and favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution. That's a whole lot of information. I hope you learned some stuff. If you did, click like on the video, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, post them in that comment section, and have a beautiful day. Peace.